Tēnā koutou, haere mai, and welcome to this APEC virtual media event, our first for 2021. I am Jahan Castaneda, your MC today. A very warm welcome to our media here in Te Whanganui Atara, Wellington, and also a special welcome to our media joining us virtually from across the region. It's really great to have you all here today. So as APEC's work gets underway this year, there are so many challenges to address. The pandemic, of course, along with issues like climate change and growing protectionism. For the economies that are united by the Pacific Ocean, there has never been a more important time to join, work and grow together. During APEC 2021, literally thousands of officials will be working together virtually across 11 separate time zones to bring this agenda and this conversation to life. Today is your chance to ask your questions around New Zealand's objectives for its host year. So shortly I will introduce APEC's 2021 SOM Chair, Vangelis Vitalis, and APEC's Executive Director, Dr. Rebecca Santa Maria. She will be joining us virtually today as well. Both of them will share some short remarks about the coming year. Then we'll have time for your questions. We have about half an hour for this. So many of you have submitted these already. I would ask you to please unmute yourself if I call on you to ask your question, and then remute yourself after asking that question. Everyone else, it would be great if you can keep your cameras on. It's really good to be able to see you on our screen here in Wellington. If you would like to submit a question as part of this media event, it is not too late. You can use our direct message function to reach the APEC media team here in the capital. So you will find them at the top of the participants list. Just click on the circle icon around APEC NZ Media Team and submit your question. So please tell us your name, your media organisation and what you would like to ask. Now rest assured, if we don't get to your question in this session, the APEC Media Team will follow up with you after the event with the information you have requested. So let's kick off with a short video. This is a bit of a taste of what New Zealand has to offer during its host year.
Kia ora. I'm Jaden from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kia ora is a Māori word for saying hello, down here in the economy that is lucky enough to be hosting APEC 2021. Just not actually down here. Like you, we were ready to welcome everyone to our homes, to give representatives of all 21 APEC economies a taste of who we are. But also like you, we are determined to support the global COVID response. And that's why you're viewing us like this, virtually. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome to your virtual introduction to Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are people of open hearts, where you will be welcomed as part of a community that believes in bringing people together. This is how we will all join together. We are people of open minds, where different views are shared and supported, and hard work and teamwork is encouraged. This is how we will all work together, all the while embracing and leading technology that helps push the world forward positively. Boats that fly, what's next? This is how we will all grow together. Join, work, grow together. Pretty important words, aren't they, Prime Minister?
They really are, Jaden. As we plan for recovery from COVID-19, it is economic cooperation through APEC, the most dynamic region in the world's economy, that will help us all rebuild. Like never before, the scale of the challenges the world faces today requires us all to work together for the greater good. We will create an environment where connections can be made and APEC's important work can continue, including progress on sustainability, ensuring widespread adoption of digital tools to drive productivity, and developing inclusive plans that create opportunities for all our people. To all the 2021 APEC delegates, we look forward to providing a warm welcome to Aotearoa, New Zealand, virtually, as we join, work, grow together.
Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
Yes, so a great snapshot there of how New Zealand will be welcoming its delegates virtually this year. So let's hear now from our first speaker. Vangelis Vitalis is APEC's 2021 SOM Chair. Now, the SOM Chair position is appointed by the host economy to support the preparation of APEC's policy agenda and also to coordinate the work of senior officials. Vangelis is also the Deputy Secretary of the Trade and Economic Group at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's had an impressive career working as an economist and a trade expert within the ministry, but also at global institutions like the OECD and the World Economic Forum. A very warm welcome to you, Vangelis. Thanks for being here.
Many thanks. Thank you. So, thank you all. Very warm welcome, very warm New Zealand welcome to you all. Really nice to see you. I thought what I'd do is I'd talk a little bit about the context for the way in which we're thinking about how we host our year. And then talk specifically about what the New Zealand priorities are going to be. So the first thing to say is that this is certainly going to be a challenging year. To state the obvious, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty to manage around the health crisis that we face, but also the economic consequences of that crisis in terms of both trade, but also the feedback loops back into our domestic economies. And that's within economies across our region, but also across the region itself. The second contextual point I want to make is that the assumptions that have governed the way we think about integration across our region for the last 30 years are really under tremendous strain. Most obviously, the rules-based system is under pressure. Second, there is rising protectionism. We are seeing a second wave of protectionism across our region, unfortunately driven by the pandemic. And that's one of the things that we're going to need to deal with. In fact, this has been the sharpest spike in protectionism since the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995. The third kind of working assumption that we've had is the social license for integration across the region would be sustained, but that's clearly under pressure as well. It has not just been driven by COVID, but it's certainly exacerbated by that situation. And then we have APEC itself, this institution that we care a lot about and is so fundamental to New Zealand's prosperity, has had its own challenges over the last 3 years. In 2018, leaders were not able to agree a consensus statement. In 2019, the meeting had to be cancelled of leaders. And then in 2020, Malaysia had to switch to a virtual year about 1/4 of the way through their hosting itself, which imposes its own serious challenges. But we have Malaysia to thank for the fact that we got a consensus leaders statement. We also got a very important statement called the Putrajaya Vision for an open, dynamic, resilient region. And that Putrajaya Vision, a one-page, crisp, sharp document, is the task of New Zealand to convert now into an implementation plan for 21 economies for the next 20 years. And that brings me to the New Zealand priorities. That is our overwhelming priority, is to deliver something for the 21 economies in APEC, an implementation plan that works for 20 years, that covers the broad range of issues that the Putrajaya Vision has provided us. Turning then to the very specific New Zealand priorities for our year, they are essentially in 3 areas: the classical trade and economic issues, the second is the digital and innovation area, and the third, of course, is sustainability and inclusion. So starting with the classical, the bits that APEC is most well known for, the economic structural reform element. So this year, one of our big tasks is to deliver an economic structural reform instrument to refresh that, so that will be the 2021 deliverable of the big economic piece of work. In the trade area, there are several important elements that we're going to be working on. First of all, APEC traditionally has been a very strong supporter of the multilateral trading system, and we'll be wanting to send a very positive, strong signal, including through the ministerial that our Minister of Trade will host in the middle of the year. And I should also say that we are in a very important year for APEC. The APEC leaders meeting will happen just before COP26 for the climate change meeting, but also ahead of the WTO Ministerial Conference meeting at the end of the year. So APEC is, as always, well positioned to contribute those big ideas to that. And in the trade and economic area, we have a number of ideas that we would like to take forward, including both to respond to the immediate crisis that we face. So to do something about medical products, how do we move them around? How can we ensure vaccines flow across our region as quickly as possible? And how can trade enable that? The other area that we're certainly wanting to work on is the role of the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So we have some building blocks starting to emerge. We have CPTPP, we have RCEP, APEC is the cement that binds these building blocks together that we want to build on and create the foundation for a prosperous and dynamic region, as leaders have agreed through the Putrajaya vision. Turning to the digital and innovation space, you heard the Prime Minister talk about how important that is. One of our big challenges, of course, is to make sure we take the opportunity that the digital revolution, in a sense, has driven as a consequence of the pandemic. Literally hundreds of thousands of small and medium enterprises have moved onto digital platforms, and that has given them access to bigger, new and important markets across our region that simply were not available to them before the pandemic hit. Unfortunately, too, though, one of the challenges that the digital revolution is providing is the risk of a widening digital divide. We know that women, Indigenous communities and remote and rural communities have been hardest hit by the pandemic, and that digital divide is something we're going to need to think very seriously about. In practical terms, what is it that we can do in our APEC year? Well, some of the things that APEC does very well is it creates templates that then become the new standard across the region. So, for example, electronic certification. It is a sad state of affairs that during the pandemic, we were able across our region to accept electronic certificates. When you sent your product across a border, you could then send an electronic certificate because it was no longer safe to move paper across borders. Unfortunately, many economies in our region are returning to the paper-based system. That adds transaction costs and that adds real costs to doing business across the region. So we want to be using APEC as a way of driving change that is sustainable across that area. And then finally, in the sustainability and inclusion space, we have a very busy working agenda here. Clearly, we want to advance the La Serena roadmap for women's economic empowerment. Our focus this year will be very much on the concrete policy deliverables and how that can be reflected in the implementation plan. So obvious things like women's representation, pay equity, those kinds of challenges that we need to deal with both within our economies but also across them as well. No surprise too that for New Zealand, the Indigenous economy is an important element of our agenda this year. We'll be working with others to find ways to bring that to the attention of the 21 economies, because we ourselves know how crucially important the Indigenous economy is, the Maori economy is, of course, to New Zealand's growth prospects. There'll also be a food security ministerial, so a very important event where we get to talk about how does food move across borders, and are we able to ensure that the people across the region, the 21 economies, have access to safe, high-quality food, and that we are making sure that the enabling environment exists to drive that forward. And then finally, in climate change, specifically identified in the Putrajaya vision, what is it we might be able to do together in that space? And there's at least two big initiatives that we want to advance together with our counterparts in the 21 economies. And that includes environmental goods and services. APEC is still the only international institution that has an agreed list of environmental goods. So things like solar panels, wastewater management systems. Can we expand that list? Could we agree also to add to that environmental services, to make this a contribution from APEC to fit into the idea that APEC is an incubator of good ideas, and to take that forward into the wider agenda, including as a contribution to the WTO process, but also to COP26, the climate change conference, which is so pressing and urgent ahead of us. So look, let me stop there. I hope I've given you a sense of the context in which we're operating, the challenges we face, but also both the responsibility that New Zealand feels to deliver a responsive and relevant organisation, but also to deliver concrete, meaningful outcomes that drive change across our region, that benefit all of our people, consistent with what leaders asked us to do through the Putrajaya vision. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Vangelis Vitalis. Thank you for your comments there, and please stay with us and take some questions shortly. Let's move on now to our next speaker. Dr. Rebecca Santamaria is the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. She's based in Singapore. In her role, Dr. Rebecca advises and provides support to APEC's 21 diverse member economies. Now, prior to this, she was a top civil servant and trade negotiator in her native Malaysia, and she played a key role in Malaysia's participation in multilateral trade and cooperation. Dr. Rebecca, it's great to have you with us. Over to you. Dr. Rebecca, please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much for that reminder, Kia ora, and good morning and good day to all of you. Thank you so much for the kind invitation for me to share this stage with Vangelis. He's done a very good job explaining what we're going to do this year. I have not much to add, just to say this. The success of APEC really comes in when we are faced with crisis, and we saw it last year. There are two important realizations that happened last year. One is that we can do this. The multilateral economic cooperation and the APEC process can flourish under the new normal. We showed very clearly how we pivoted very quickly to a virtual format and had the ministers' meetings, the leaders meet virtually with very clear deliverables. So this year, New Zealand's hosting year, we will get to see more innovation to the format as well as to the work that we will be delivering. And the second point is that in a crisis, really, APEC moves together. 2020, we saw how we came under threat, but we came together and reaffirmed our commitment to each other. Among other things, the joint pursuit of sustainability, inclusivity, resilience, not just for today, but also for future generations. There's a lot more to be done, and Vangelis has highlighted this. A number of work streams already in place. Key will be the traditional areas of trade and investment, but more importantly, the new areas of inclusivity and sustainability that's really going to take us forward this year, make us APEC value add to the global conversations around inclusivity and sustainability. Besides that, there's also work to ensure that post-pandemic recovery, what are we going to do? How would APEC contribute to post-COVID recovery? And that is a key area of work for this year. And our contribution, APEC's contribution, is also in preparing the ground. Vangelis talked about structural reform, but how do we prepare the ground? Getting policymakers ready, preparing them through capacity building, to sharing of best practices. This is the strength of APEC, incubating new ideas, as has been mentioned already. That's what we bring to the table, and we will see more of this year, given that we're operating in a different environment. How do we get these messages across? How do we bring our folks together as we've been so successful in doing it the past few years? I'll just stop there because we will be able to take questions and share more details of the work that we're doing going ahead. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Rebecca. Let's get straight now to those questions. Please remember to unmute yourself before asking your question. We begin with Tom Pula-Strecker from New Zealand news outlet Stuff. Tom, over to you for your question.
Kia ora. What has your experience been so far of the arrangements that officials have put in place to try to replicate the opportunities for informal discussions that would normally take place face-to-face at APEC? Has that changed to the character of the discussions that you've seen take place so far?
Vangelis?
So yeah, no, it's a good question, and one we've been very focused on indeed over the past few months, as we've been actually more than a few months, as we've been preparing for this virtual event. I think what it means is that we've had to be much more intensive and engaged early on. So the intensity with which, for example, I as chair am pursuing my bilaterals to make sure that I really do understand where my colleagues are coming from, I think there's a greater intensity to that compared to what we might have done when we might have waited for people to arrive in New Zealand before we had the meetings. Instead, I'm meeting much more frequently and much more regularly with my colleagues in a virtual format, and a lot of that is happening to try to build that relationship and try to get that sense of where people are going to come from and how we then work together. So that's my first comment. My second comment would be the way in which we're running the meetings. We're really looking to change that, and we hope that might be carried forward into the future. Sort of one obvious thing to say is that we're actually getting a lot more people participating in meetings by doing them virtually. So interestingly, normally we would have expected around 2,000 officials to arrive in New Zealand for SOM 1. The number of people that have registered for the meetings which are ongoing this week is nearly 3,000. So we're getting greater participation from economies, and that I think is a very positive thing if you think about the kinds of issues we're dealing with and the need to make sure that all agencies are involved in interacting. And I can tell you that the intensity of my colleagues, the New Zealand team here, to reach out, engage, listen, work with has redoubled in intensity compared to what we might have done if we'd been doing that physically. Then the meetings themselves, we're looking to do a lot of innovation around how we run those. For a start, we're being very tightly focused. So instead of a sprawling meeting agenda that would run over several days, we're saying 3 hours for a meeting. And we're tightly focused on that. So last night, for example, we introduced the concept of a countdown clock to try to encourage colleagues to stay within a 2-minute limit to respond to interventions, to try to encourage a bit of interaction and dialogue. And I think what I've been struck with, we hosted an SOM meeting, informal senior officials meeting, at the end of November last year. And if I think about where we were then and where we are now, there's almost no comparison. I've been struck at how willing people are to interact, to put down their statement that they would normally be reading out and actually engage with us on the things. So some of the things we've introduced are putting panel sessions into senior officials meetings, making sure that we have more regular dialogues with business. So earlier this week we had a big ABAC dialogue, so the APEC business grouping, so that senior officials really got a genuine chance to really listen to and work with them. So we are doing a lot to try to compensate for the challenge that we face of not having these face-to-face meetings. The other thing that we're doing is also we're introducing breakout groups. So we have these meetings of literally hundreds of senior officials, and then we are moving into breakout groups to try to, again, to encourage that interaction and engagement that we would normally have had in person. The onus is definitely on us as host and me as chair to really work with delegations, to really work that hard and that intensity. And I can tell you that we're certainly doing that in an exhaustive and exhausting way, you can be assured.
Thank you for that.
Lots of waves, I'll do that now.
There's plenty of waving.
Thank you, Tom. Our next question is from Sangjia from Saishin in China. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
So my question would be directed to Mr. Vitalis. I'm from Caixin. It's a Chinese financial media. So my question would be, in terms of economic cooperation among the Asian Pacific economies, other initiatives like RCEP and CPTPP have gained a lot of momentum in the recent years. So vis-a-vis these initiatives, what would be APEC's different focus in promoting economic cooperations? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Great, really good question. I think the answer to that question really is the complementarity between the role of APEC, which is a consensus-based, non-binding organisation, the incubator for the good ideas, and then the legal treaties that get negotiated for RCEP, for example, and for CPTPP, the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. Those are all legal international treaties. It takes years to negotiate them. So, for example, the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA took nearly 6 years to negotiate. RCEP, nearly 8 or 9. CPTPP, depending on when you start counting, could be counted as nearly a decade. So those international treaties, they take time. What APEC brings is an agility, and it is an ability to respond and be relevant to the immediate things that we need to work on. So to give you a very practical example of what it is that APEC has delivered, I was the chief negotiator for the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, and we were grappling in that negotiation with customs procedures. Now, customs procedures are actually a really important way of facilitating trade across the region and making sure that products that come from New Zealand or from Indonesia can enter each other's markets as quickly as possible. We achieved in the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement measurable improvements in the way in which we could move our products across the border. Those improvements were then carried over into the RCEP negotiations where, for example, we have a commitment from all RCEP partners to move, for example, chilled products across the border in 6 hours. That is a very significant shift. The roots of that is the work that has been done over the past decade and a half in in APEC, where we've been working together to build trust and confidence in each other's systems, and then testing out with one another. Could we work on this? What do you think of this? And then building the template. That template was carried over directly into the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. It then found its way into the RCEP, and then indeed in the CPTPP process, we look to build and improve on that. APEC, in other words, is the ecosystem that provides the norms, the guidelines, the standards that then find their way into the legal treaties that are the international free trade agreements that are such important building blocks. As I said at the start, we have these building blocks that drive us towards multilateralism and to regional economic integration. APEC in many ways is the cement that holds these building blocks together.
Thank you. Our next question is from Chinhan Chen from The Paper in China. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, hi. I'm the journalist from The Paper in China, and I have a question about the COVID-19 vaccine. We know that New Zealand will use the APEC to take a global approach to COVID-19 vaccine, and that would limit to fight the coronavirus. And I was wondering what kind of the agreement is APEC expected to reach on COVID-19 vaccine this year, and how will promote the implementation of the agreement? Thank you.
Dr. Rebecca, shall we go to you for this question?
I can take it as well.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Vangelis will provide more details, but I just to a broad picture. Vaccine distribution and uptake is really crucial, and we know that, as recovery depends on this, and the eventual movement of people will also depend on this. The focus will really be on ensuring equitable and inclusive access. And there is work that we're doing. We're engaging with our member economies on this score, and the details I'm sure Vangelis will provide us. But it's really an opportunity for APEC to lead the way here. Vangelis, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rebecca. Look, it is a really good question, and it is a pressing and vital question. And of course, APEC will want to respond to that. It goes to the point I made about a responsive and relevant international institution. So there is an active discussion underway already on the question of vaccines, and we are working very hard to try to find what is the solution to making sure we can move vaccines across the border, and clearly trade is an enabler of that. So to give you a couple of practical examples, the first thing I'd say is that it is a depressing objective fact that across our region, many economies impose tariffs, even on vaccines. So there are economies in our regions that impose tariffs of up to 6% on vaccines. They impose tariffs of 20.7% on the syringes that we need to distribute the vaccines. When we're carrying the vaccines across the border, we need specialised cooling boxes that can store the vaccine at minus 70 degrees Celsius, minus 70. Many economies in our region impose tariffs of 30% on that. In other words, we are imposing costs on our economies and on our people when we're trying exactly what you're suggesting we need to do, which is to fight the pandemic. So as an objective fact, there are tariffs there, and we're going to be asking each other, is this really the best way to fight the pandemic when we impose this cost? And let me give you a practical example of how my economy's thought about this. Midway through the pandemic last year, we discovered that New Zealand actually imposed a 5% tariff on soap. So at the time when our Prime Minister was urging New Zealanders to wash their hands to make sure we could combat this virus, we were increasing the cost to the consumer in the supermarket of soap by up to 5%. We eliminated unilaterally that tariff. Along with, I might say, all of the tariffs, for example, on syringes and vaccinations and so on, any residual tariffs that we considered needed to fight the pandemic, we unilaterally moved those. So I think there is a question amongst the 21 of us, what do we need to do? But tariffs are not the only problem around the vaccine distribution. There are clearly export restrictions, which are a major and really significant constraint on trade, and there are some troubling developments there, unfortunately, outside the region as well as within it, which are going to be a big challenge that we're going to want to send a signal about amongst the 21. We also need to find ways to more swiftly move vaccines across borders. And so here, New Zealand does have a proposal around best practice guidelines. It goes to the point that I made earlier about APEC providing the norms and the guidelines and the best practice to drive change across economies. So some of those very practical measures are when a vaccine cooling box arrives at your border, it doesn't sit at your border for up to 10 days. It moves quickly. If we can move products, chilled food products across borders in 6 hours in the RCEP agreement, surely vaccines, that really urgent question for all of us across the region, should be moved more swiftly. So that's we have tariffs, we have a whole series of non-tariff measures, the export restrictions, the customs procedures where we'd want to be sending messages. And then also there are some very practical elements. DHL has estimated that we're going to need 15,000 flights to move the vaccines across the region. 200,000 administrative structures are going to be needed to roll out the vaccines across our economies. Transportation from the airports, from the ports, through to remote communities. We're going to need to be thinking about all of that. We're going to need 15 million of these specialised cooling boxes simply across the APEC region, again, to distribute these vaccines. How are we going to meaningfully do that, and what should APEC think about? And this is the point about being an incubator of good ideas and being responsive and relevant. What are we going to say about those things? And these are the kinds of things we're working through at the moment, at the start of this year.
Excellent. Time now for our fourth question. Sam Sachdeva from Newsroom has this question. Over to you, Sam.
Kia ora. Vangelis, you spoke recently, I think last month, about a proposal to eliminate tariffs for COVID-19 essential items across the economies. I was just wondering how much progress has been made in that in recent weeks in the discussions of senior officials. What concerns, if any, are being raised by member economies about that proposal, and how likely you think it is that you will actually be able to get some sort of agreement across the line, given I think you talked about a time frame of the Trade Ministers meeting in May?
So a couple of observations there which take us back to my response to the previous question around tariffs. So it is indeed an objective fact that many of us across the region do impose tariffs on the medical products that we need to fight the pandemic. So one of the things we could practically do is moving the vaccines across border, the best practice guidelines, and then also identifying a set of medical products that we all agree we need to look at, each of us domestically, to drive reform and enable better access for our citizens and for our people to ensure they can be safe from the pandemic. So the question of the tariff reduction and elimination is one that all economies are going to want to be thinking about, but it needs to be informed by a serious discussion about what are the products that we need to do to fight this pandemic. So, for example, face masks, syringes, to give you another example, face masks and gloves attract a tariff of 18.6%. Again, crucial elements in fighting the pandemic. I think the main message of our thinking around the response to the pandemic is not only a responsive and relevant APEC, but also the fact that in a global crisis like this, you really do need cooperation. And that is the secret here, and that is the core thing that APEC does so well and so agilely.
Thank you. Time now for our fifth question. This question comes from Ching Ting Jung from the 21st Century Business Herald. Over to you.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. My question is, the APEC has struggled to reach agreements in recent years. So what's made you guys confident that this year's conference will be different? Thank you.
Dr. Rebecca, over to you on this one.
Yeah, here's the strength of APEC, the ability to bring disparate groups, officials from 21 economies from across the region, from least developed to developed, at the table, talking to each other. And that's important, to have that conversation, to keep that conversation going. That's important, to hear each other out, to listen to each other, and then find solutions. You must understand that we're not a geopolitical body, we're an economic body, and the focus is always on how can we work together to make it easier to do business. And very importantly, we have the business community sitting with us, having discussions with us and in consultation with us. And in this time of pandemic, we also have the people sitting around with us. We have the think tanks engaging us, the experts, the health experts. So it is that sort of mindset which allows us to further those conversations, to have deeper conversations, so that policymakers then make informed decisions, and that's important. Like I said, we're not binding, but that doesn't mean we cannot have deeper conversations on things that we need to do unilaterally, bilaterally, plurilaterally, for the greater good of the region.
Would you like to add to this?
Yeah, look, it is a fair question, and it is, I made the point earlier that we'd been operating in this very challenging context, given that in 2018 and 2019, we were not able to either reach a consensus, and then in 2019 we had to cancel the meeting. But I think what we should not forget is that Malaysia really did us all a favour. There are really no excuses, because we really got back to consensus with thanks to Malaysia's very able chairing, incidentally, in a virtual context. So there is a precedent there for being able to drive consensus-based solutions. And the secret, we heard from my Malaysian counterpart last night, I should say early this morning, who talked about the intensity of his engagement with his counterparts, with all of us, to try to bring together a consensus. And then the goodwill amongst ministers and leaders to ensure that at this time of crisis, this important institution is really genuinely responsive and relevant. And part of that is consensus and practical, concrete outcomes that actually do make a difference across our region and are faithful to the vision that leaders agreed last year about a prosperous and resilient region.
Our next question comes from Wong Mung Jae from CGTN. Please ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is, the pandemic dealt a huge blow to the world economy. Some say those who can control the virus will gain an economic foothold for the future. Compared to other parts of the world, the Asia-Pacific region has been relatively successful in containing COVID-19. So does this mean a new economic era for the region is approaching?
A new economic.
Please repeat the last part of your question.
Sure. Compared to other parts of the world, the Asia-Pacific region has been relatively successful in containing COVID-19. So does this mean a new economic era for the region is approaching?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a nice way to frame it. I think the way that I would see it is that there is an opportunity to respond to the pandemic immediately. So we have an immediate term crisis to respond to. But I think the big challenge for New Zealand is to make sure that APEC responds to that immediate crisis, the COVID-19, and ensures that we all do stay safe. And as you said, our region has a better record than some in terms of managing the pandemic. But I think also what's going to be a real important test for us in APEC is, can we also respond to the challenges that are on the horizon? So climate change, sustainability, the digital revolution. Can we take advantage of the opportunity of this year to leverage our futures there? And I think that is really the thing that we need to do. So indeed, I do see a big economic opportunity for us, but we have to get it right this year. So no pressure, New Zealand.
Vangelis, just before we wrap up, we've had a question from our local media here in Wellington around a change in the COVID-19 environment in New Zealand during this year. Is there any possibility of New Zealand holding in-person APEC meetings later in the year should the situation improve?
So look, let me be really blunt about it. The answer to that is very directly no. The way we look at the region and the opportunities for that, we have had to reluctantly conclude that is not going to be possible, not least given the enormous amount of planning that has gone into already setting up the process. I'm actually confident that the way in which we're going to host both leaders and ministers, as well as senior officials and other officials across the region, is going to deliver a tangible, meaningful, responsive and relevant APEC.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. We have our last question coming in now. What work is APEC doing about travel between countries? Would you like to take this?
Look, so clearly this is going to be one of the preoccupations for the year. I don't want to prejudice where the 21 economies might land, but as chair, I'm hearing from a number of economies about the urgency of needing to deal with this. And of course, APEC has a very proud tradition of thinking about movement of people across borders. The APEC Business Travel Card, of course, is one of the big successes of this. And if you think about what that means, for example, for New Zealand businesses, is that visa-free access. If you're not in APEC, you don't get that advantage. So I think there's a lot of discussion going on, and I'm hearing a lot of it as chair, but it is very early days indeed to pronounce on that, and I don't want to get out ahead of where economies are.
Yeah. Can I just add, Vangelis,
sure,
that there is work being done. There is a study on cross-border mobility in the region, and our policy support unit is working with one of the economies of APEC to look at the policies on movement of people across the region, specifically focused on this. You know, there are travel bubbles and green lanes. Some have been adopted, but not very successfully. Some have suspended following new emergence of COVID. So clearly, there is that understanding, that appreciation that we need to develop some standardized verification of tests and vaccines so that we can facilitate travel. So this is ongoing. The work is ongoing. And the Business Mobility Working Group that we have in APEC is also engaging with different international organizations that are also looking at this. Now, the last thing we want to do is duplicate, but we want to learn from each other. We want to support each other. And this is the work that's going on. And we will continue this conversation throughout the year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rebecca, and that brings us to the end of this APEC 2021 media event, our first for the year. There'll be many more of these conferences as the months progress, including with our ministers and our leaders. I'd like to thank Vangelis Vitalis for your time and Dr. Rebecca Santa Maria for beaming in for us as well. It's been really great to hear about New Zealand's priorities for this host year, so thank you for your time. Thank you to our members of the media here in Wellington and around the region. And to close, I'm going to leave you with some voices of the future. APEC's work this year will shape our region for the next couple of decades, so it makes sense to hear from some young Kiwis about why this is all so important to them. Mā te wā, and we'll see you soon.
I want APEC leaders to focus on managing effectively the surge in job automation. We need to empower our minority and diverse groups in society to create and co-construct the solutions required for a post-COVID economic recovery.
Helping young and vulnerable people towards safe and empowering work.
I'd like to see APEC leaders put their words on climate change into action. APEC really needs to focus on centering women's and Indigenous groups' voices.
The old ways cannot solve these new problems. We need action now.
Indigenous economic inclusion will add great value to the sustainability of the entire APEC region.
Join, work, grow, together. Haumie, huie, tai ki e.
So what I would say is APEC has always had the strong involvement and engagement of the United States, regardless of the administration. Obviously, with the incoming administration, we're waiting to see what exactly they want to do and how they